Mark Reynolds had always envisioned retirement as a peaceful chapter of his life, far removed from the chaos of his former career as a police officer. After 2 decades on the force, he had seen enough crime and conflict to last a lifetime. So, when he finally hung up his badge, he settled into a quaint neighborhood, hoping for serenity among friendly neighbors and the comforting sounds of nature. As he sipped his morning coffee on the patio, Mark took pride in his well-kept yard and pristine pool. His home was a sanctuary, a stark contrast to the bustling city streets he once patrolled. However, tranquility was short-lived. It didn't take long for the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer, Mrs. Thompson, to emerge. Dubbed by locals as the HOA Karen, she wielded her authority with an iron fist and an overinflated sense of entitlement. At first, Mark tried to ignore her incessant complaints about trivial matters, lawn heights, mailbox colors, and even the occasional late trash pickup. But when Mrs. Thompson brazenly trespassed onto his property to use his pool without permission, it crossed a line. Her dismissive attitude during their confrontation ignited something within him, a simmering frustration that he hadn't felt in years. Mark realized that this would not be just another annoyance, it was time to take action. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Thompson, Mark had skills that could turn the tables, and he was ready to deploy them. It started innocently enough on a sweltering Saturday afternoon. Mark was lounging by his pool, enjoying the warm sun and the gentle sound of water lapping against the sides. Just as he settled into a moment of blissful solitude, his peace was shattered. He turned to see Mrs. Thompson, clad in a brightly colored swimsuit and sunglasses, strutting through his gate with an air of entitlement that made his blood boil. "Hey, Mark," she called out, waving as if they were old friends. "I thought I'd take a dip. It's such a lovely day." Mark's jaw clenched. "This is private property, Mrs. Thompson. You can't just walk in here." She brushed off his words with a dismissive wave. "Oh, come on. We both know the HOA says the pool is for community use. Besides, it's too hot to care about little rules like that." Mark felt his frustration simmering as he stood up, confronting her directly. "Those rules don't apply to my property. I'd appreciate it if you left." Instead of taking his words seriously, she laughed and splashed into the water, clearly enjoying her defiance. Mark's heart raced, not just from anger but from disbelief that someone could be so brazenly disrespectful. As she floated in the cool water, Mark realized this would be the first of many confrontations. The situation had escalated beyond mere annoyance, it was time for him to take action against this unrelenting trespasser. After the shocking incident with Mrs. Thompson, Mark thought he had made his boundaries clear. However, it didn't take long for her to test his patience again. Just days later, as he returned home from running errands, he spotted her lounging by his pool once more, a drink in hand and a smug smile on her face. It was as if she reveled in pushing his buttons, and today she seemed determined to cross every line. "Hey, Mark. You should really consider making this a community pool. Everyone would love it," she called out, completely ignoring his previous warnings. Mark approached her with a mix of disbelief and irritation. "This is my property, Mrs. Thompson. You need to leave." "Oh, don't be such a grouch. I'm just trying to enjoy the amenities we all pay for," she replied, her tone dripping with condescension. Mark felt a surge of anger as she continued to dismiss him. The situation escalated further when he found that she had not only trespassed again but had also invited several neighbors over for an impromptu gathering at his pool, without his consent. Laughter and splashing echoed through the yard as they made themselves at home. Feeling trapped in his own space, Mark's frustration reached a boiling point. This was no longer just about trespassing, it was about respect and reclaiming his sanctuary. He realized that he needed to employ the skills he'd honed during his years on the force. If she wanted a game of cat and mouse, he would ensure that he was the one holding all the cards. As Mark sat in his living room, the chaotic sounds of laughter and splashing from his pool still ringing in his ears, he knew it was time to take action. The annoyance had transformed into a burning desire for revenge. Drawing on his experience as a police officer, he began plotting how to outsmart Mrs. Thompson and put an end to her trespassing once and for all. He started by surveying the layout of his property, noting all the vantage points and potential hiding spots. Mark envisioned setting up discreet surveillance cameras around the pool area, not just to catch her in the act, but to document her behavior for future reference. He could use video footage to show others in the community just how brazenly she violated his privacy. Next, he thought about psychological tactics. What if he created misleading signs? Perhaps placing a sign that suggested the pool was under maintenance would deter her temporarily. He even considered staging a fake pool party with friends at an odd hour, just to observe how she would react. Would she still try to breach his property if she thought someone might be watching? Mark smiled to himself as he scribbled ideas in a notebook. This wasn't just about reclaiming his space, it was about teaching Mrs. Thompson a lesson she wouldn't forget. With every detail planned out, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was time to turn the tables and show her that she had underestimated him, and that this ex-cop was not one to be trifled with. With his plan in place, Mark felt a rush of adrenaline as he prepared for the execution. He installed the surveillance cameras discreetly, making sure they were well hidden among the foliage and garden decorations. The cameras would capture every moment, providing the evidence he needed to confront Mrs. Thompson and the HOA. He even placed a few fake, pool closed for maintenance signs around the perimeter, hoping to deter any uninvited guests. On a bright Saturday afternoon, Mark invited a couple of friends over for what he dubbed a pool party. As they lounged by the water, laughing and enjoying drinks, he kept an eye on the gate, waiting for Mrs. Thompson's inevitable intrusion. Sure enough, after an hour of fun, she appeared, strutting toward his property with her usual confidence. "Hey, Mark. I saw your friends and thought I'd join in," she called out, brushing past him as if she owned the place. Mark exchanged glances with his friends, who raised their eyebrows in surprise. He feigned a smile and said, "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, we're just about to close up for the day." Undeterred, she waded into the pool, splashing water playfully at his friends. Mark's heart raced as he activated the cameras remotely, capturing her blatant disregard for his boundaries. He watched from a distance as she continued to soak up the sun, completely oblivious to the trap he had laid out for her. With each passing moment, Mark felt a sense of satisfaction building within him. The time had come to show her that her days of trespassing were numbered, and soon enough, she would regret underestimating him. As the afternoon wore on, Mark's friends began to notice the tension in the air. They exchanged glances, sensing that the atmosphere had shifted from light-hearted fun to a simmering undercurrent of conflict. The turning point came when Mrs. Thompson, emboldened by her earlier trespasses, decided to push her luck even further. "Your friends are so boring, Mark," she declared, splashing water at them. "Let's spice things up. I have some great pool games we could play." Mark's friends laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond, but he felt a surge of irritation. This was his space, and she was ruining it with her audacious antics. As Mrs. Thompson continued to make herself at home, he caught sight of the hidden cameras recording her every move. He knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. With a deep breath, Mark decided it was time to confront her directly. "Mrs. Thompson," he said firmly, walking over to the edge of the pool. "I think you need to understand that this is my property. You're not welcome here without my permission." Her laughter faded as she met his gaze. "Oh, come on. It's just a little fun. The HOA won't mind." "I think they will when they see the footage I've captured," Mark interrupted, pointing toward the cameras hidden in the shadows. The color drained from her face as she realized she had been recorded in her blatant disregard for his boundaries. This was it, the turning point where Mark took control of the situation and made it clear that her reign of entitlement was coming to an end. The atmosphere shifted dramatically as Mark's words hung in the air. Mrs. Thompson's bravado faltered, a flush creeping across her cheeks as the reality of her situation set in. She looked around, her eyes darting nervously to the hidden cameras, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of fear replace her usual confidence. "Footage," she stammered, attempting to regain her composure. "What are you talking about?" Mark stepped closer, his demeanor calm but authoritative. "I've recorded everything, your repeated trespassing, your disrespect for my property. I think the HOA will take this quite seriously." He gestured toward his friends, who were now silent spectators, their expressions a mix of disbelief and amusement at witnessing this confrontation. Mark could see Mrs. Thompson calculating her next move. She was cornered, and he savored every second of it. With a shaky laugh, she tried to downplay the situation. "You wouldn't really show that to anyone, would you? We're neighbors after all." "Neighbors respect each other's boundaries," Mark replied firmly. "You've crossed mine one too many times." As he spoke, he could feel the weight of his experience as a police officer guiding him. This wasn't just about his pool, it was about standing up against someone who thought they were above the rules. The confrontation reached its peak when he pulled out his phone, scrolling through the footage with deliberate slowness. "Let me make this clear," he said, locking eyes with her. "This is your last warning. Leave my property alone, or I'll ensure everyone sees exactly what you've been up to." The stakes had never been higher, and Mark was ready to enforce his boundaries once and for all. The confrontation with Mrs. Thompson sent ripples through the neighborhood. Word spread quickly about the incident, fueled by the astonished reactions of Mark's friends, who couldn't help but share the story. Soon, neighbors began to gather outside Mark's home, curious about the unfolding drama and eager to hear his side of the story. As they congregated, Mark decided it was time to take control of the narrative. He invited everyone to his backyard, where he had set up a small screen to show the footage from his cameras. The crowd murmured in anticipation as he hit play, revealing Mrs. Thompson's repeated trespasses and her audacious disregard for his privacy. Gasps filled the air as they watched her brazenly float in his pool, laughing with abandon while ignoring his warnings. The community was shocked. Many had encountered her meddling ways but never realized the extent of her entitlement. When the video ended, Mark turned to face his neighbors. "This isn't just about me," he explained. "We all deserve respect and privacy in our own homes. We let her walk all over us for too long." The crowd erupted in agreement, united in their newfound understanding of what had been happening under their noses. They rallied together, determined to bring change to their HOA policies and ensure that no one would feel powerless in their own neighborhood again. In that moment, Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had not only reclaimed his own space but had also sparked a movement within the community to stand up against unyielding authority figures like Mrs. Thompson. The tide was turning, and he could see a brighter future ahead for everyone involved. The community meeting was a turning point for the neighborhood. Mark stood at the forefront, surrounded by supportive neighbors who had witnessed the footage and were now eager to take action. Together, they discussed ways to hold Mrs. Thompson accountable for her actions and to reform the HOA's overly rigid policies that allowed her behavior to flourish unchecked. As the weeks passed, the tide shifted dramatically. With Mark's evidence in hand, the community banded together to present their concerns to the HOA board. They demanded stricter enforcement of property rights and clearer guidelines on what constituted acceptable behavior among neighbors. The once dominant presence of Mrs. Thompson began to wane as more residents spoke up about their own experiences with her petty grievances and overreach. Finally, after a tense meeting, the board agreed to amend the rules, enhancing protections for homeowners against harassment and ensuring that everyone would have a voice in community matters. Mrs. Thompson was officially reprimanded for her actions, and her influence within the HOA diminished significantly. With newfound respect from his neighbors, Mark felt a sense of pride wash over him. He had not only reclaimed his own space but had also empowered others to stand up for themselves. As summer approached, he opened his pool for community gatherings, fostering unity among residents who had once been divided by fear and intimidation. In this transformed atmosphere, Mark found peace in his retirement once more, knowing that he had made a lasting impact on his neighborhood, a place where everyone could enjoy their homes without fear of intrusion. As summer unfolded, Mark took a moment to reflect on the whirlwind of events that had transformed his quiet neighborhood. The confrontation with Mrs. Thompson had ignited not just a battle for his property but a movement that fostered camaraderie among neighbors who had once felt isolated and powerless. It was remarkable how a single incident could catalyze such profound change. Mark reveled in the newfound spirit of community. His pool, once a source of conflict, had become a gathering place for laughter and connection. Families brought dishes to share, children splashed joyfully, and everyone felt a sense of belonging. The barriers that had divided them were slowly dissolving, replaced by mutual respect and understanding. Yet, as he enjoyed these moments, Mark understood that vigilance was necessary. He remembered his days on the force, how easily complacency could lead to neglect. He resolved to remain an active participant in the community, advocating for fairness and openness in the HOA, ensuring that no one would have to endure what he had faced. In quiet evenings spent with friends by the pool, Mark shared stories of his past, connecting with neighbors in ways he never anticipated. He realized that standing up for oneself wasn't just about revenge, it was about creating an environment where everyone felt safe and valued. As he watched the sunset dip below the horizon, Mark felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had turned a personal trial into an opportunity for growth, not just for himself but for everyone around him. The future looked bright, and he was ready to embrace it fully.